The topic today is in-house emergency response, post-fall rescue and retrieval. So let's get on. This was put together by PMI and Vertical Rescue Solutions. We can start talking with falls happen. We all know this, especially working at height. What you can see here are some facts and figures for falls in the last few years, and then a summary of 1992 to 2004. I think what's important to note is that number of falls go up and they go down. Some years are better, some years are worse. To me, what that indicates is that simply writing standards for better fall protection, better safety, doesn't do much. We need to make sure that the workers understand that they need to make this a personal thing, that they need to be vested in their safety and preventing these fatal falls, making sure that we can facilitate a rescue versus a recovery. Just to give some examples of falls, here's one from June of 2009, a scaffolding incident. You can tell from the picture that our worker was correctly harnessed and using his safety equipment, fell 10 feet, and they were rescued by the fire department. I think what's important to note is it was pretty lucky that the fire department bucket truck or ladder truck was able to make it up to these workers, but they were rescued and brought down safely. Another incident from Maine last year, a fall from a bucket truck. This individual actually fell out of the bucket 30 feet to the pavement below. He did live, so that's fortunate, but worth noting, he was not correctly safetied off, and he fell out. This could have easily been a fatal accident. It could have also easily been an accident where he was arrested by his fall protection equipment and got back onto work in just a couple of minutes. Third incident from last year as well in Pennsylvania, a fall from a natural gas drill rig. As far as distance of falls go, a pretty short one, only 20 feet. But this one was fatal. For anyone who's been up on these rigs, they are complicated systems. The pathway and walkways are not always the easiest place to be. You can see just in this picture, you've got workers walking up a ladder with safety rails, but no harnesses or anything. This is an accident that can easily happen. And then finally, one from January of last year in Lincoln, Nebraska, fall in a meatpacking facility, probably what most of us don't think of immediately when we think of an area where someone may be working at height. Unfortunately, this one was 70 feet, and it was, in fact, fatal. And something I think important to note about this slide is to look at the fellow in the slide there. I think we all know someone who looks just like this guy. He is almost a dead ringer for my own dad. This was a fellow who went to work that morning, planning to come home that evening, just like every other day. And unfortunately, that's not how it panned out. So what we need to consider is that wherever fall protection is being used or should be being used, rescue preparation must go hand in hand. Now, that seems a little obvious to say, but I think what's important to infer from this, regardless of if a crew is trained in rescue, they're going to try to facilitate a rescue on their partner. If myself and another individual are up on a tower and I fall, I know that he's going to try and get me down, try and save me. He's not going to just stand there and watch, and therefore he needs to be well trained. If he's facilitating a rescue with no sort of training or improper equipment, the likelihood that one or both of us are going to get hurt or killed increases exponentially. So it's so important that we have a rescue plan in place, one with the correct equipment, the correct procedures to get everybody down safely. In this slide, we're looking at some OSHA regulations. You can look at both of these, and you can see that they read fairly similarly. Both say the employer shall provide for prompt rescue of employees in the event of a fall or shall assure the self-rescue capabilities of employees. And the one below, the employer shall provide for prompt rescue of employees in the event of a fall or shall assure that employees are able to rescue themselves. Two things important to note in this, I think. One, that the employees are able to facilitate a rescue, but one that perhaps gets overlooked is the first line, the employer shall provide. I think in a lot of situations it's assumed that the workers may provide their own equipment, may provide their own gear, but according to OSHA, this is up to the employer. So it's important as an employer to make sure that our employees do have the correct equipment and are in a good position to be able to self-rescue. Worth noting also, these OSHA regulations apply both to general industry and construction. There can be some debate about which one applies to which scenario. but these do apply to both. Of course, these are open to interpretation, and we can see here prompt rescue from 2000, prompt rescue not defined in the standard. It says the word prompt requires that the rescue be performed quickly. Well, what is quickly? Is quickly 5 minutes? Is quickly an hour? Does it depend on our scenario? We get a little more clarification in 2004. It says standards do not provide specifically for maximum allowable time. However, it does give examples at the bottom. An employee exposed to electric shock at a work location must be able to be reached by trained persons within 4 minutes. That's very, very quickly. When you consider probably a good 30 seconds to a minute of realizing that someone's fallen and trying to decide what to do, how to get going, we really need to be on the ball and up to get these people quickly. So again, there aren't finite guidelines saying you must be able to do this in X amount of time, but it is important that this rescue be facilitated in a timely manner. Now, a lot of these rescues rely on external personnel. A lot of companies expect that the fire department will be available always to help them out in a rescue situation. Chief Johnson here mentions that technical rescues are high risk but low frequency events. We don't see them that often, or the fire department doesn't. And there's a lot involved. You've got people up at height, the rescuers and the worker or workers involved in the event. And the rarer of that incident type, the more likely it is that the fire department may have not been trained on it for quite some time, or may have not been trained on it at all. All things to consider. In hands with that, I think we all know, due to the way the economy has fared in the last couple of years, the fire department, your local fire department down the street that may have been washing money 5 years ago with all new equipment, all new trucks, hiring more employees, may be half of its former self today. We can see here that at the bottom, Orlando officials are laying off 46 firefighters. That's a number of firefighters. And again, when we're talking about training with regards to high-risk, low-frequency events, those are probably the trainings that are going to see cuts first. The fire department has to focus on what they do most often. So rescuing someone off, say, a electrical tower or a wind turbine, maybe something that just has to go away in terms of more frequent use. Now, ANSI Z339.2 does provide us with some requirements to create a comprehensive plan for fall protection management. It basically tells you these are the things that you should have in place to consider for a rescue plan. And those break down into a pre-plan. Pre-plan on one hand meaning we have planned ahead of time to do this, but we can break it down into the acronym. There are personnel to consider, rescue, how we're going to facilitate the rescue, and the equipment that we use. So the PRE, it's a great way to remember and think about the 3 different areas that should be considered when building a rescue plan. So first, let's talk about personnel, the people who are going to be involved in this rescue, and that includes the person being rescued. External, again, fire departments. As an employer working on a job site, you should be aware of the technical capability and the medical capability, among other things, of your local fire department. While in a large city, you may have some teams that are extremely capable and versed in high-angle, difficult rescues, or if we're out on a remote location, it may be little more than a volunteer fire department that's never even considered something like that. This is definitely something we want to look into before we get ourselves into a rescue situation. External personnel as well. Things we need to consider: familiarity with the worksite methods. If we're up on a wind turbine inside the nacelle, our local fire department may have never seen the inside of that. It may be completely new to them. They should be familiar with your fall hazard survey, which hopefully you have filled out before taking on the job. Things to consider such as weather, overhead power lines, things like that. Types of identified emergencies to which the response agency is capable of responding. We should know ahead of time if our fire department can even deal with this sort of rescue. What is their tallest ladder truck? Do they have a ladder truck? If it's only 100 feet, it's not going to help us out on a 150-foot tower. Maximum potential response time to all areas covered. This can take place, let's say, out west, working on remote sites. Some of these counties can be hundreds, if not thousands, of square miles. Rescue may be an hour away by driving. And on the same side of that coin, we could be in downtown New York City, but the nearest fire department is 25 blocks away, and it's 5 o'clock rush hour. Again, it could be an hour before they're able to get to us. Familiarity with the equipment, going back again to talking about the nacelle. Does your local fire department know, are they familiar with the equipment that you're using, the equipment that you'll be on, etc.? Requirement for advance notice of work. Many fire departments require, if you're going to be working at height and you plan to use them as part of your rescue plan, they want to know ahead of time. They want to be ready in case of this sort of emergency. So this is not something that we want to find out after the fact. Definitely something that needs to be addressed before doing any sort of work at height. What are the methods that the responding team will use? Will they bring a ladder truck? Do they have a high angle rescue team? How are they going to work to help us get our friend and coworker down? And then means of maintaining ongoing capability. How are they able to keep up with different response issues? Again, on personnel, now there are internal personnel. These are the work crew that we have working on this. The number of exposed workers. Is it 2 guys going up to do a visual inspection on a tower, or is it a crew of 10 that are going to be moving heavy steel into the air and working with electrical devices, for example? Same thing, the type of work. Is this going to be just a simple up and down sort of job, or are we going to be up there every day for 2 weeks? Other potential hazards, things that should be in the job site analysis, overhead power lines, strong winds, thunderstorms, anything like that, all should be identified before any of our personnel get up into a work environment. And finally, the skill level of the workers. Is this a crew of a foreman and 5 new guys, or is this a grizzled crew of 10 veterans that have been at this for decades? Definitely something to consider in case an emergency does happen. To go back a little bit again, let's do recall that for any of these workers that are going to be in a situation at height, the employer shall assure the self-rescue capability of these employees. Everyone that's going up needs to be able to get down, and that might sound a little funny to say, but it can be easily overlooked, especially in a situation where we have somebody new to the job site. Now this picture is a little funny. It always gets a little laugh, but it's a very appropriate picture. This is a fellow that was taking a VRS class, and we were he was new to a rope environment, and we wanted people to hang in a harness from their dorsal ring and see how it feels, see how quickly it becomes uncomfortable to be hanging in this situation. Once again, this facilitates the need for immediate assistance to coworkers. We really don't want someone hanging there for 20 minutes before we're able to start getting ready to get them down. Now, please remember this slide. We are going to talk about suspension intolerance a little bit later in this presentation, so this is a slide that goes along with that quite well. What we had touched on before about coworkers are going to facilitate a rescue regardless of training. Here's an example from June of 2009. A worker fell into a 1,500-gallon holding tank, a rather large tank, and somewhat of a confined space rescue. Well, his coworker, in the attempt of the rescue, cut a hole into the tank. It seemed the most expeditious route to him, and as a result, 7 employees and 3 of the EMS responders who came along were hospitalized. It's great everybody got out, but there was certainly a better way to make sure that this happened, and this all goes back to the pre-training, or pre-planning, excuse me, making sure that we have a plan in place for how we're going to deal with getting someone out. Another example, June 2009. Now this is an example of when things work exactly as they're supposed to. A roofer working with an SRL and a harness fell, 2-foot fall, and was caught by the SRL. Rescued by his coworkers in under 5 minutes. More than likely, just walked a ladder up under him and let him step down. This fellow, after probably walking out to the truck and getting a new pair of shorts, was able to return to work within an hour. This is exactly how these things are supposed to go. Now finally, another example for personnel, internal personnel. Occasionally, we might have the luxury of having standby rescuers. On a large corporate job site, there may be a professional rescue team always ready to go. That they're trained, they're familiar with the equipment, they are able to do advanced technical rescues, and with something like this, the goal is that we can have the rescue in place within 10 minutes. This is, if this is something that's available, this is a fantastic, fantastic option. So now that we've discussed personnel, let's talk about our rescue procedures, how we're actually going to do the rescue. Now again, remember we had talked about suspension intolerance, and there is lots of debate that surrounds suspension intolerance. Some will tell you that it's a myth, that it doesn't really exist. I think most people feel that it is a very real thing, although could argue about the length of time it takes before it becomes a fatal problem. However, in my opinion and my experience, it is very real. Like we went back to the slide of the fellow hanging there. Anyone who's hung in a harness for even just a couple minutes realizes that it's extremely uncomfortable. Your extremities begin to go numb quickly due to a restricted blood flow. And, you know, when we get down to it, even if you don't feel that it is a critical issue, nonetheless, it's just a good thing to use as a rule of thumb, that we need to be able to get this person down as quickly as possible and consider the suspension intolerance as part of the equation. Now here's an example of an OSHA accident where an employee did die while suspended. You can read along here, but employee number 1 was using a wood seat assembly attached to a friction descent device, wearing a safety belt and lanyard attached to an independent lifeline. Sounds great. When he went over the parapet wall, however, he did not hook up his seat assembly. He fell 6 feet and was suspended by his safety belt 50 feet above ground level. A delay in rescue efforts resulted in his death of asphyxia due to safety belt compressing his diaphragm and lungs. The real tragedy in this, I think, is that this fellow was working by himself. This is something that should never be done. There should always be at least one other person to make sure to be able to facilitate the rescue, at the very least to be able to call 911, to call down to the other workers on the ground and say, hey, we're in trouble. This poor fellow was alone and as a result is no longer with us. Things to consider when doing this rescue, entry versus non-entry. Are we going to have someone else get onto rope or exposed to height to get to this person, or can we reach them from a safe location? Could be either way. Minimization of necessary training. We want to make sure that our workers are trained to do the rescues that are going to apply to them. There's really no need for a tower worker to be trained in setting up you know, a horizontal line. We want to make sure that it doesn't get confusing, that they're trained to facilitate the rescues that they'll be involved with. On that same page, fail-safe system operations. We want these systems to be as simple as possible so they're not extremely complicated for these workers. Let's remember, more often than not, the workers who are going to be facilitating these rescues are precisely that, workers. They're not trained professional rescuers. So we want to make this as easy as possible for them. Avoiding suspension intolerance, we want this rescue to take place quickly, and we want to avoid that with our subject. We need to be able to release them from their fall arrest device, and we need to have a plan in place for that. It really doesn't do much good for a rescuer to get down to our subject and they can't remove him from his system. And then finally, a route to safety. It's not always going to be as simple as going straight down. There could be power lines in our way, there could be a roof line, any number of things. We may have to get to a point and adjust and move to a different area to continue out to safety. So all things to consider when planning for our rescue. Now there are several different types. The emergency escape, basically a one-man escape from a situation. We can also talk about coworker rescue with non-entry. You can see here in the first slide or picture to the left, our subject is hanging from his safety lanyard, and in the picture to the right, our rescuer is standing on a platform lowering an attachment to our subject to get him out. This person is not going to be exposed to height to that danger. Now there's also entry, where a rescuer goes down to our subject. You can see both pictures here. We have one person below and our rescuer coming in to get this person safely to the ground. Finally, we have professional rescue. As you can see, these guys are setting up a fairly complicated highline system, and if that's something that's available, on a job site or a work site, fantastic. Professional rescuer is great to have. Also, finally, medical considerations. Is our subject conscious? Have they? Is the reason for the situation that they're in something besides a fall? Did they have a heart attack while climbing the ladder? And in our picture on the right there, suspension intolerance. When we do have someone that's been suspended on rope for some time, we want to get them to the ground, and we don't want to just lay them flat. So we have bad blood rushing to their vital organs and killing them after we've gone through this entire rescue. So we do need to consider the medical considerations that may exist, either related to the fall or perhaps non-related. Finally, for the E in pre-planning, we need to talk about our equipment. OSHA regulations, compliance concerns, equipment which allows employees to rescue themselves after a fall may be desirable. Devices that have descent capabilities. When we are at height, sure, the best thing to do is get to the ground so we can get this person the attention that they need. So things to consider in our equipment. We want this to be a solution, not a part. Ideally, our rescue equipment is precisely that. It is a solution, a kit, if you will, of parts and equipment used precisely for the kind of rescue that we're going to undertake. It needs to be applicable to the work site. What works well in a confined space situation may not work so well 400 feet in the air. So we want to make sure that the equipment we're using is designed for the job that we're doing. It needs to be compact. It needs to be able to basically get into any scenario that our workers could be in, be it 1,000 feet in the air or in a tight, confined trench space, anything like that. It needs to be purpose-built, similar to applicable to work site. We want this equipment to be built with the purpose of rescue, with equipment that was intended for that purpose. Simple to use. Again, like our fail-safe. We don't want our rescuer to get to where he can begin his rescue and have to fumble with the equipment and try and remember how to use it, and it takes another 10, 15 minutes before he gets worked out. The simpler we can make it for these guys, the better. Fail-safe, same idea. And again, a systems emphasis. We want this to be a rescue system. We want it to be a easily flowing system to get this person to safety. And again, several different ways for that. Escape, coworker rescue, and then professional rescue if you have availability to that. ANSI Z359.4, safety requirements for assisted rescue and self-rescue systems, subsystems, and components. These are the compliance regulations that will recognize equipment that meets these standards suitable for rescue. When you are putting together an industrial rescue solution, you certainly want to look for ANSI-compliant equipment. So that generally covers the PRE, parts of our pre-plan for rescue. Again, personnel, rescue, and equipment. All three of these work together to provide the best safety for our workers up there. All are equally important and should all be considered together. Wrapping up here towards the end, we do need to consider that these systems may exist not necessarily for a fall. 2009, a grain silo incident, and this seems to happen several times every year. An employee was in a silo and the grain started coming in, and he had no way to escape from this situation. Suffocated young man. In 2010 in San Diego, on top of a nacelle in a wind tower, had two workers that were burned, flash fire inside the nacelle. They hadn't fallen, but they were burned to a point where they were incapable of facilitating their own rescue. So the rescuers came up and lowered these guys and got them down to safety. And finally, 2007, this was one that happened right here in Colorado, up in Georgetown, confined space incident, some workers in cleaning it was a tunnel, I believe it was used for moving water, if I'm correct, but nonetheless, a fire happened with the equipment they were using. This was on a steep slope, and they were unable to get up to the point where they could escape, and 5 individuals were killed in that incident. So that about wraps it up for our rescue after a fall. I do appreciate all of you listening. Again, my name is Robert Gowder. I'm an account manager with PMI. And I'll turn this back over to Jess if there are any questions that need to be answered. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Let me switch the screen back over. Okay, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and type them in the chat/questions area of your control panel. And so far we have one. If I have some of my employees who are not firefighters trained to rescue coworkers, do they have to follow NFPA standards?
That's a good question, and I believe I can verify that with some of our more versed individuals in standards, but I believe the answer is no. NFPA standards in general in terms of equipment apply to equipment. There are also ANSI standards. Firefighters and fire departments use NFPA certified equipment, but just for example, tower industry workers, communication tower workers, really don't pay that much attention to it. What they're looking for is an ANSI stamp. So my answer to that would be no. They do not have to use NFPA certified equipment.
Okay, great. We don't have any other questions at the moment, so I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping this up. So if you do have any other questions, go ahead and type them in, and I'll get them before the end of the presentation. But if you have questions later on that you happen to think of, you can ask Robert them via email. There will be a button on our website at the link shown on your screen where you can email Robert, and you can also see his email on the screen right there. And also the slides from this presentation are going to be available at that link, as well as the recording of the presentation, and that'll be available within about 24 hours. We host these webinars once a month so keep your eye on our website for dates and topics. And for news and updates, you can sign up for our e-newsletter at the link shown on your screen, and also you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We post updates on just general stuff going on at PMI, as well as all of our webinars, so you can stay up to date that way. And it doesn't look like we have any other questions, so we'll go ahead and wrap this up. So thanks everybody for attending today, and we hope you enjoyed it, and thank you, Robert, for doing this.
Thank you, Jess.
All right, have a great day, everybody.